Hi, NACIS. Is everyone awake? Hi, NACIS on the camera. So I'm going to talk about branding and cartography today, and I'm also going to be talking about breaking the rules, which is also why I am walking out here, because I felt like it was the funniest, most obvious way to talk about breaking the rules. I didn't actually break the rules because I talked to the wonderful team back there and asked if it was okay if I moved around and stuff. But mostly secret, I like moving around because it's how I get rid of my nervous kinetic energy. So, how are we going to break the rules? Well, first, I wanted to explain why I'm talking about breaking the rules and branding in the first place. And that's kind of the overview of where we'll be going, why graphics related to brand color schemes and why they don't always work for maps. And then you'll understand what those topics mean when I get there, but I feel like it's a good point of reference. So at my last job at the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, I redesigned a lot of the maps. And if you went to NACIS, I think in Minneapolis, you may have seen me give a talk on rebranding the map styles there. The most notable one was the program map. And at my current job, I defined the brand of our map style and aesthetic. So the past 4 years, really, I have become really familiar with branding things, I guess. It ended up happening accidentally, and I just wanted to share everything I've kind of experienced and learned for everyone who maybe wants to point at a specific spot and say, this person said that it's okay to break the rules, so we don't have to use all these really contrasted colors in maps. Because I've had it happen a few times where obviously an organization really wants to continue to use their brand colors because it's really important. That's what they're for. It's like high identity. But with maps, the colors don't always work. Well, I'll get there. Anyway, so the point is there's really strict rules in branding. There's probably, depending on the organization, there can be maybe only 6 pages worth of branding rules. It can be an entire packet. It could theoretically be like 50 pages of very specific definitions. There was someone who was talking about using Pac-Man, I think in PCD, and he talked about how the Pac-Man organization wrote him back and said that the stems were the wrong color and they're facing the wrong direction. Like, those are very, very specific brand rules that had to be changed because that's what the brand said needed to happen. So those kind of very specific rules that I'm gonna tell you maybe it's okay to break. And this is just an example where for those who aren't as familiar with working with organizations that are super strict because they need to be to have brands, there's usually like a set of like primary colors and then usually suggested color palettes to use with those that are like analogous or complementary. And sometimes there's a lot and sometimes there's a little. When I was at OFTA, there was 2 main colors and only like 5 colors that you're allowed to use to pair with those. And obviously, we all see organizations all the time that have very impactful, contrasted, bright colors that you kind of recognize instantly. And obviously, that's also the point of logos and other such things. National Geographic, we all recognize that yellow border. I wanted to throw a map company in there. And of course, there's as we all know, color has different kinds of ways to be expressed. CMYK, RGB, Pantone for spot color. Print and web have different rules. Some companies are only essentially one color, like these are all essentially just blue and white, which is really hard to, well, theoretically it's not really hard to make maps out of only one color, monochromatic. Daniel gave a great talk about that. So technically you could brand yourself based off only monochromatic stuff. So if you want to do that, definitely watch Daniel's talk. Mine is talking about trying to break the rules and use not as many colors as possible, but broaden your range if you feel restricted. But also if you are really restricted, check out Daniel's talk from PCD. And these are just a lot of, I wanted to put a map of a bunch of very high contrast logos, which this looks really cool, obviously, and I think a lot of people for this kind of map, it's highly emotive, but ultimately it's still technically hard to read and it wouldn't be something you would necessarily want to show someone if there was supposed to be like information stacked on top of it, because it would get lost among the endless information that's already on there. Just another example, and this is just, I wanted to show like high contrast brand colors, and those are all very strong colors and all very recognizable, but again, like would be hard to use all at once. I just really wanted to throw this map up there because I love Culver's. Hey, Wisconsin. And I was just really happy that McDonald's wasn't taking over. And this is where McDonald's is not located. And I wanted to use this as an example of, obviously there are maps you can use and use the primary colors, and it's great, but it starts getting hard to stack stuff on there. So again, as I said, it's important because brand colors are used to recognize, they really pop. You want them to come to the fore immediately, like when you're advertising, and that works for maps as well. Oh no. I'm really sorry. Pretend like you didn't see that nerdy picture of me yet. You're supposed to laugh at it in the end. So here's a great example of my last job where they did use the initial, like this is graphics. So graphics have the possibility of obviously using a very limited color palette. And I think it's not, it's easier to do it in graphics because you're not stacking as many layers on top of each other like in maps when that happens, because we often can have like 5 or 6 data layers. And it's kind of like the map rule where you can use 5 colors, like the least amount of colors, and it's still legible. And this is an example of using like a complementary color, that yellow tone. But at OFTA, when it all got put on a map, it kind of was immediately heavily contrasted and a little hard to read, which is why I did everything I did a few years ago. And I have a talk about that, which I'm happy to share. I'll go through that quickly, but that's like an example of the blue being heavily contrasted and the other one. And even McDonald's knows that it shouldn't use just the red to their red. That's not their red, it's a different red. This is on their website. I kept the link on there. They used a different tone red so that they could actually have a gradated scale to show where the most McDonald's are located internationally. And yeah, they're not using their brand color at all because they realized they needed to break the rules. And why do I think you should break branding rules that are so very often very strict? Well, you want to make the data, underlying data, legible, and you want to allow the possibility of more data layers, because often we're given a lot of data. Depending on where you're working, and you don't necessarily know what it's going to be, so you have to plan ahead for if it's going to be something complicated or not to make a well-designed map. So basically, like, that's cartography in a nutshell. Oliver did a great job on talking about Carto 101, and I quoted myself quoting him on the slide. So, there's kind of a process behind it, just like any other design process. And when you start branding anything or redesigning a brand, you really need to become as familiar as possible with the maps at your organization. And there's a lot of different ways you can go about this process. I think it involves a lot of iterations and writing down the different kind of elements that a map has, and what are the features and data layers that your organization, or you yourself, if you have your own company or whatever, what do you need the most in most of your maps? Not all your maps, but what is the map that you think will be made the most often, and what will likely be the features on there? Whether it's just rivers and cities, or is there going to be heavy terrain underneath, and is it going to be colored terrain or just like subtle? You have to really think about the different ways you're going to be visualizing this. And you're not the only one that needs to be thinking about this. Like, definitely, if you're in an organization with more people and it's not just you, talk to people. If you're new, the part of the process is really like getting to know what is happening there, and remind yourself that if you were told you need to rebrand something or brand something, it is going to possibly be a longer process. It's okay if it takes a longer period of time. You don't need to feel rushed. Because there's a lot of questions you need to ask. Who are the users? Like, who's reading it? Are there multiple kinds of users? If you're making the maps internally, are there different teams using it for different reasons? Because you're going to have to design it differently than if it was just for one person, as we all know. And a question that I found was important to ask was, what are the potential future needs for yourself or for your organization? Like, try to think what's down the road for your brand. If it feels like what you're making is kind of new, and if mapping is a new thing, it's going to be changing. So try to think of what could happen in the future to try to like consider the branding while you're changing it. I mean, it's also okay to rebrand things, obviously, but it makes it easier and you don't have to change as much. So all that familiarizing is to also think of a base map. Now, I am not using base map in terms of base map as we all know and love, which is like Google Tiles and Map Tiles and those kind of like base maps for tiles. I just mean like, in your head, what is the most used map of your space? So at OFTA, the most used map was the program map, and that's ultimately what I really needed to rebrand in terms of how everyone was thinking of OFTA maps. I put a National Geographic map up there. I don't, like National Geographic obviously makes a lot of different kind of maps, but like this is something that's really iconic for a lot of people. This could theoretically be a base map for National Geographic. There's many base maps for National Geographic. And of course, an actual base map from Google is also their base map. National Park Services also has lots of different kinds of maps, but this is one of their kind of base maps of what, and we heard talks about this at many NACIS. We need to come up with a plural name, I think. So running into color rules, how do you go about breaking them? Well, first, I don't think you should not use your brand's colors at all. I mean, you could if you could manage to convince people to do that. But how you can tell them it's okay if you run into problems about not using your brand's colors everywhere is saying like, well, I really want to use the colors to bring impact and to bring things to the fore, like the things that are the most important. Use your brand's colors in lines and polygons and borders and patterns, in transparencies, and in any way that you think possibilities are endless. It could be in a monochromatic terrain of a pinkish blue, like the OFTA blue. Sorry, I keep bringing up OFTA. I just happen to work with it a lot. This is not for my last job, this is for my current job. That lime-ish green is one of our main colors, and so is that blue. You also can use your brand's colors in the marginalia if you feel like it's really contrasted and you don't want to use it as the state poly fills because that makes it really heavily contrasted. You can also break the rules in even like what brand's colors you're using that are contrast. So this orange is not technically an orange that is in our logo, but it's a really bright color, so I started using it a lot. But it is one of the pairing colors, but that is okay because if it's across a lot of the maps, it still therefore is branded by our brand, especially if it's paired with other things that relate to our brand, the other elements. And while you're thinking about bringing things to the fore, you also want to think about what you're bringing to the background, like what you want to make subtle, because it's really important what colors you're choosing for that as well. And not just colors, like texture and line width and everything. Like obviously we all know that every single element decision matters in an entire design. So you want to think about the variance of your brand colors, whether it's a slightly darker variant of your brand color or something slightly lighter, or maybe you added a little bit of cyan or a little bit of yellow, like whatever may work for that particular base map you're making, because perceptual cognition is really cool, and as long as it looks close enough to your brand color, you'll be able to make a lot of people happy. Honestly, in a lot of cases, you don't need to tell people you're not using the exact color. We're all cartographers, and we know that perceptual cognition happens with things that are heavily contrasted on layered maps, and that's an optical illusion example, sorry. And you think about stuff that's not at all in your brand scheme with complementary and analogous colors. And I did do that often. It's cool because in Illustrator, where I work a lot, you can really go into a color scheme and pick, not even actively think about it. I can share this on Twitter later. I talked about it in a talk a couple years ago. And you can just pick oh, I want analogous colors to this color, and I want complementary colors to this color, or colors that just work well with it. And then this brown, these two browns, I didn't actually actively think about those. I just used something in Illustrator to see what worked well with that orange. And sorry, I'm moving, is that okay? These two greens are based off of two very contrasted greens of our brand, and I lightened this quite a bit. It was a very dark forest green, and then I added a little yellow because I wanted it to pop, but I didn't want it to be too heavy. And then this was based off of that lime green dot that I showed before, and I just made it a little less limey and also a little lighter, and I circled those two greens, and that blue is not our brand's blue. This is our brand's blue. That's a darker blue, but that river was really important, so I made it darker and thicker to make it pop more. And this brown is a pattern of, like I said, something analogous that I chose. And essentially, I broke the rules for everything except for the program area boundary, but that's okay because it's still pretty close to our brand colors. And I keep track of these. You should keep track of them, write them down. If you just want to use your eyedropper tool constantly, if you're the only person working on these maps, I kind of do this sometimes where you're ooh, I need this color again. I'm going to go into this file that I know I worked on it and copy that color, because whether it's internal or external, people are going to notice that these are staying consistent, which is essentially what branding is. So congratulations, if you do a variant of all these things, you are now a rule breaker, but technically you are also making new rules, so you're not a rule breaker, so it's really confusing. Especially if you keep a style sheet. And of course, it's not just about color. Maps are about a lot of things, and I really talked about color today, but don't forget about typeface. This is a very brief consideration about typeface. Elaine, I don't know if she's here, has great discussions about typeface. So does Daniel on his blog. I was running out of time when I was coming up with the many things I could talk about. But if something I've run into with a lot of brands is that you only can use one typeface, and that seems really limiting, but of course there's so many different options you can do with one single typeface. This is just Calibri, the default PowerPoint font. So I bold, italic, caps, caps, bold, caps, italic, bold, and then there's also kerning possibilities, and color, as we all know, has a lot of power. So you can play around with that to your heart's content, and then brand it. And brand within a brand. So you have this base map that you made where you decided some of your branding choices because it's what's used the most. So that's kind of what's really important probably to you and to a lot of people, to make sure the thing that's seen the most is what's branded. But remember that while you made these definitions, you're allowed to break the rules because what we all know and love, such as National Geographic, has branding, but also their maps still look really different, but in a good way, because variety is the spice of life. And in maps, there's always so many different data layers that can be used, and of course, infographics to be paired with, like Claire and Riley were talking about earlier. And depending on what's going on that page or on the screen, you need to take into consideration all those things. I just repeated that quote, sorry. So just go into whatever stylistic means that you were keeping track of these things, and just choose, this is for my thesis. I thought it was a good time to pull out these elements. Just choose 10 elements from each style that you defined, or it can probably even just be 3 or 4. And just use those because a yellow border on a map is, for National Geographic, honestly enough for many to recognize National Geographic maps. Me constantly using that orange tone, and many other elements that I do in my current jobs maps, end up creating a stylistic element that becomes a brand. So break your rules, combine your different rules. As long as some of the rules are consistent, congrats. You now have a branded map. And this is not a map, this is a painting by Pablo Picasso, a realistic painting. So I will leave by saying, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist and become a cubist painter. Oh, and then there are also some Washington Post examples of variety. And Lauren Tierney, I don't know if she's in here, talked about this the other day as well. Nat Slaughter also talked about documentation and iterative design. This NACIS has been amazing. And break the rules.